Alone on a Winter Storm by Rasta Karma. A bit of backstory on me, as the event doesn't sound that scary, but for a shy kid like I was terrified. I've been quite lonely for quite some time while I was younger. I had a lot of trouble making new friends because of the anxiety, but I've always been told I was very mature for my age, which I guess was a good thing, but at the same time did explain the fact that I had few friends. Because of that, I developed quite the imagination. It would become my way of escaping the real world, and to this day, it helped me greatly control my anxiety and find a job in video games that I still love to this day. But it does sometimes come with a downside, as you'll soon learn. I live in Canada, a part that is famous for having harsh winters. You know the Canadian cliché. On a weekend mid-January, my parents had to leave town for the night and left me alone. Nothing unusual, since I was sometimes left on my own because I knew how to take care of myself, and my parents knew I would not do anything dangerous or stupid. Add to that the fact that we lived in a quiet neighborhood, which eased their minds for leaving an 11-year-old kid home alone. My sisters, being quite older than me, were already long gone from our home to live on their own. I'd say, as most kids that age, the simple idea of being alone was exhilarating. I could finally play video games until my eyes hurt, without having anyone to shut the console down and force me to do my homework. For anyone living in the sun, it is truly the best feeling to play games inside when there is a snowstorm outside. That being said, I'll stick to the scary part. I think enough background was given to understand my state of mind, so pardon me, I'll brutally skip to that fateful night. So it was starting to get quite late for a preteen. The clock was about to start a new day, and the only light inside was that of the old CRT TV screening my game of GoldenEye in the basement. Funny thing, I can't remember what I ate for breakfast that morning, but I could tell you every little detail of that night. It seems that the brain tends to protect the information better when something big breaks the routine. The clock hit midnight, and we had those old clocks you often find in those creepy horror movies, where it's always stored in the grandparents' house. It would sound the clock 12 times in a very loud and heavy tone, where metal seems to resonate in an infinite echo. At this exact moment, like somehow it knew it would add to the creepiness, a loud knock could be heard from the front door. I guess I must have been hypnotized by my game, as the heavy sound kind of woke me up. It was still the day when I was playing the game, and having lost count of time, I was surprised to see it dark outside. I told me it was quite weird to have someone knock so late, and in the middle of winter, during a snowstorm. My parents were quite close to the front neighbors, and since the conditions outside were very bad, maybe the electricity was cut for them, and maybe they came to ask if they could stay the night. Yeah, you know, kids don't think so clearly about these things. I quickly looked through the windows on the side of the door, but I saw nothing. All I could see was the same white void while looking through the peephole. I decided it was nothing, so I went back to my game so I could finish the mission and call it off for a night. I hadn't even gotten to my controller when I heard another loud bang on the door, but this time it kept knocking until I managed to get on the level of the house. As soon as I could reach for the last steps, it went silent once again. At that point, I started to have a very bad, eerie feeling. It's unnatural to have such a loud bang to disappear, and then the next second hearing nothing else. It's like the snowstorm had stopped instantly without warning. Add to that fact that I would have heard footsteps in the snow because of how quiet it was. I decided that I had had enough, and I would go to sleep straightway without having any of the morning lights arrive faster. I was about to go back down when I started hearing knocks on the basement windows. I totally lost it. The sound seemed to be coming from each side of the house, but how could that be? I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find and decided to hide in the dark corner of the house to peek outside and try to see what was causing the sound. Again, as fast as it came, the knocking stopped, and it was dead silent. I waited 5 minutes, 15 minutes, what seemed to be hours as I panicked inside. I finally decided that whatever was there, it must be gone now, so I could gather what courage I had left and go to close my game as fast as I could. Since there was a window directly in the room where my TV was in the basement, I looked outside to try to see something, and that is when it struck me. There was no trace in the snow, like nobody was there 3 minutes ago. I knew the snowstorm was not powerful enough to hide the footsteps, so I started to imagine the worst. It didn't help that I believed in ghosts for a long time, especially that time, as I have seen my fair share of inexplicable things. I finally closed the game console and the TV and decided to go straight to my bed located on the second floor of the house. We live in what we call a Canadian house, if it helps give an idea. As soon as everything was closed, the snowstorm seemed to come back from nowhere, and then the wind got as powerful as I had ever seen. The noise was getting crazy. You could hear the trees outside creaking and cracking, and at that exact moment, I could hear it again. Loud knocks on the front door, but this time it was coupled with the knocks on the windows. I literally froze from fear for a few minutes, but I realized I had to do something or my heart would literally jump out of my chest, which is not a really good feeling. I took the closest blanket I could and ran headfirst into our cold room storage, where there were no windows and where I could lock the door. I could not say how long I was in there, as time warps when you face that kind of situation. All I knew was if I stayed there for a while, knife in hand, eyes wide open, my brain was going in the worst places imaginable. I finally got out. It was still dark outside, but I was too tired at this point, and I wanted the comfort of my bed more than anything in the world. Well, except maybe to see my parents or the light of day. There was no knocking anymore, and the snowstorm seemed to be back to normal. I decided before I tried to go to sleep it off to take one last peek outside, and what I saw, I still ask myself about today, or about what did it. I kid you not, but there were at least 10 snowmen outside on our yard, looking at the front door. No need to say I sprinted to my room as fast as I could, and never looked back.
The Snow Isn't Melting by E. Jawa.
I don't think I'm crazy, but part of me is hoping I am. I'm almost afraid to post this, for fear of finding out it's happening in other places. I know if I try telling people offline, they will think I'm crazy, and that won't help anyone. People never think about all the snow they bring with them into their cars, office, home, everywhere. Why would they? It's just snow after all. Once inside, it only takes minutes for remaining snow stuck to your jacket and boots to melt. It's just a normal part of winter. I know I never really thought about it. At least, not until yesterday. It started snowing here in Portland, Maine on Wednesday. I know other parts had been dealing with rough winter weather, but this was our first storm of the season. It wasn't even a bad storm. A bunch of us left the office early, but that was probably more due to work being slow. The snow was just an excuse to leave early. My girlfriend and I work at the same company, so I went home with her. It wasn't snowing that hard, but there was a decent amount of accumulation. We brushed the snow off the car windows and headed home. Once home, we had snow on our gloves, jackets and hats. Again, like any other winter storm. It was an uneventful night. She had some baking to do to prepare for Thanksgiving, and I had some Dragon Age to play. We had to get up early the next morning. We were spending Thanksgiving separately with our families, so she was going to drop me off at my parents', then head to Manchester to hers. She was going to come back on Friday. It must have been because I was tired that I chose to ignore the first signs that something was off. There was some snow on the windowsill, just a little bit, so I figured she must have opened the window briefly when I was in the bedroom. Then there was our jackets, which still retained last night's snow. There also seemed to be more of it, if only just by a little bit, than from what I remembered last night. She didn't seem to notice, and I was still waking up and too tired to care. She grabbed her jacket, and I saw some snow fall to the ground. I grabbed my other jacket, since the one I wore the previous day was more for riding my bike at night. I kissed her goodbye when we got to my parents', and she left on her way to Manchester. I really hope that wasn't our last kiss. Thanksgiving was nice, but pretty much the same as the last few years. Ours consists of breakfast, parade, dog show, movie, then dinner. Boring, but nice. My girlfriend texted me shortly after she got to her parents', saying their power was out. It was out in many places, both in Maine and New Hampshire. That night, my sister dropped me off back home. What greeted me when I opened the apartment door was shocking, to say the least. Snow everywhere. There was at least a foot covering everything. Snow tumbled into the hallway when the door opened. It was really cold too, colder than it was outside. I could see that the kitchen window was broken. A tree must have fallen, or a large branch, breaking the window, letting in the elements. Still, it seemed like entirely too much snow, considering it was only snowing through the morning and not that hard. The shards of glass that still remained in the window didn't look right either. They were white, covered in thick frost. I got my landlord. He lives in the same building. He was more shocked than I was. He said that he was here all day and didn't hear anything break. No trees, no branches, or windows. He insisted that he would take care of it, and that he would cover any hotel costs until they cleared it out and fixed the window. He must have felt guilty about not noticing all day, since he wouldn't accept my help, and said that he would have someone come and help him. I was tired and worn out, so I didn't object. I called my sister to have her come pick me up again, so I could stay at my parents'. I tried calling my girlfriend to give her the bad news, but it went straight to voicemail. She had forgotten to charge her phone the night before, so it must have died, and she hadn't been able to charge it yet. I wish I still thought that was the case. I couldn't shake the image of our apartment covered in snow. It didn't seem natural. That was when I remembered about the snow on our jackets. There was also snow on our gloves when we got home. Wouldn't that have melted, though? It's not a long drive, but with the heat on in the car, it doesn't matter now. I went to work this morning, tired from lack of sleep. Strangely, not a lot of people showed up. I know that's not abnormal for the Friday after Thanksgiving, but I mean, people who were planning to come to work today didn't show up, and we were all having trouble reaching them. Fear was really starting to set in, but I didn't know exactly the cause. Why hadn't my girlfriend called me yet? That was running through my mind a lot this morning. One of my co-workers, who I consider a friend, was one of the ones who didn't show up. I figured if I drove over, I would find he was just running late for some dumb reason, and my fears would go away. He'd probably think it's weird that I was checking up on him, but it didn't matter. I needed to do this. As soon as I saw his house, I knew my fears were justified, and panic started to creep in. Some of his windows were broken, the others completely white. I almost turned the car around right then, but I slowly pulled into his driveway. I wanted to make sure he was okay. Maybe he wasn't home, like I was. No, there was his car still there. He must have still been inside. He's still there, sitting on his couch, his frozen gaze looking at the broken window. Snow everywhere, everything cold. That's what I saw when I went inside. I can hardly say it, but it was the most frightening thing I will ever see. His eyes were frozen white, any visible skin was an unsettling shade of blue, and his arm had fallen off and shattered into hundreds of pieces. It happens fast, I know that now. I think it grows slowly, so it needs to let more inside before it can. I don't know. Maybe that's how it feeds. I'm at my parents' now. I didn't tell them what I saw. How could I, when I don't know what I saw? They asked why I was brushing and sweeping all the snow out of the house. I asked them to not go outside. That was a mistake. We should have left, all left. I forgot to check the shoe closet. 5 minutes ago, while I was typing this, I heard the windows break downstairs. It's starting to get cold. We all know the first rule, right? That everything here is true, and so be it. Even so, you always lose a little bit of credibility when something supernatural is mentioned. It just isn't real anymore from then on, no matter how much you want to believe. The true horror comes from stories that can actually be true. Well, this story is true, nevertheless. Believe it or not, I don't care. I just want to share the reason I left everything behind and moved away from my old life. Maybe find someone who is willing to listen without thinking I'm a total basket case. Is something supernatural involved? I don't know. I cannot confirm. You have to bear with me and make your own conclusions. I used to work every weekend for 9 years as a bouncer in different bars all around rural Finland. The pay was good and nights were usually pretty peaceful. Every now and then there was a fight about something petty between young hicks. You know how it is. Your dad didn't lend you the tractor for our potatoes in 2004. Now you'll pay. Something like that. I didn't really care. I just made them pay for damages and come back in a couple of months. But there were some bars that were nasty. Sometimes the only bar within 40 kilometers gets all the bad apples, and good people drive to the city because they want to avoid the violent, jobless drunks that rural areas always have more than enough of. So I decided to quit working those bars and started working only for one cute pub in the middle of nowhere. It was cozy and people were nice. They tipped well, which is really uncommon in Finland, and there were not many disputes. The only thing that was weird is that I always had to start really late, 11 p.m. to be exact. I was paid by the night, so it didn't make sense. But hey, all the better for me. Until the stupid daylight savings. In the fall of 2003, I was driving toward the bar when I realized I was about to arrive an hour early. I was in the middle of a forest, so I didn't really have any options. I'll just work one extra hour, oh, no big deal. But as I drove on, I got this feeling I shouldn't advance any farther. The darkness was enveloping around me, and I had trouble seeing, even though the headlights of my car are somewhat decent. The trees of the forest were leaning over the road, and there was something in the back of my mind telling me to turn around. But you know how these things go. I was just being silly. Afraid of the dark. I'm a huge guy who protects others for his job. The feeling would surely pass. When I arrived in front of the pub, it was silent. I knew that it should be open, but there were no lights. There was absolutely nothing going on. Actually, I couldn't see any people around either. This pub was not the only building in this little village, so where was everyone? I got out of my car and started to walk toward the pub. Then again, the feeling from earlier grew stronger. I shouldn't be going through that door. I should just stay in my car or get the hell out of there. The darkness was growing ever more threatening. What's more, I could sense that despite the darkness and emptiness, something was around. There was something in the darkness, even though I couldn't see anything. I was pretty much on edge, so I decided to seek shelter. From my car? Of course not. I'm a rational human being who doesn't believe in the supernatural. So, like a dumbass protagonist in a horror story, I decided to enter the pub. The door was unlocked, so I thought to myself that the bar must be open. Everything was normal. Maybe there was a blackout in the area. Autumn storms had been sweeping through, so that must be it. I stepped inside and was met with nothingness. No music, no people, no lights, nothing. Just the darkness, which felt like it was about to swallow me. But I did hear something. Whispering. And not creepy unison whispering of some unseen spirits, but clearly several human beings, like they would have been discussing. This time I decided to trust my instincts. Very slowly and as silently as possible, I advanced toward the whispers that were coming from the main room of the bar. The door leading there was closed, but it was a glass door with black tape for decoration. The tape was peeling off, as it was an old pub, so I peeked in from a crack that the peeling had made. I have to tell you, this part was too hard for me to write in one sitting. I started to feel uneasy again, like the darkness was still with me. But I have to share this, or else the experience will cling to me forever. The bar looked pretty normal at first. It was dark, but I could see people standing in front of the bar counter and sipping from small cups. something on the counter was acting like a faint light source. I thought it was a candle at first, but people were reaching toward it in between sips. It was a big glass jar, which was, in a way, glowing. Maybe there was a lamp in the bottom of it. I don't know. The people were whispering to themselves and filling their cups from the jar. Finally, I got a better look of the jar, and it's something I will never forget. It was filled with clear liquid, and in the liquid there was a baby floating in it. It was bloated, disintegrating, a rotting corpse of a small baby. Its skin was flaking and floating around, and people were catching the chunkier bits in their cups, and they just drank it away. They were drinking the fluids and everything. I had seen quite enough. Quickly and silently, I dashed out of the bar and outside. But when I finally reached the cold autumn air, it felt like it was too hard to breathe, like the air itself was much more solid. Moving felt like I was underwater, and at first I thought the shock was affecting me in this way. But nowadays, I think it was just the darkness. It had in a way solidified, and there was something there, something watching me. It wasn't going to let me go without a warning, but it was too weak to resist me any further. I reached my car and dialed the emergency services. Luckily, there is no cliches involved. I knew I had to call the police, and I did. There is 4G connectivity in the whole of Finland, so there was a signal. The call center fortunately didn't think it was a prank, and I told straight away that I must have witnessed the murder of an infant and that they should hurry there because I felt I was in danger. Even the car started with one try, and I drove to the main road and waited there so I could signal the arriving police. It was about 10:30 when the police arrived. At the same moment, I started to see other people walking around. They were coming from the direction of the bar and acted like there was no worry in the world. I told the police what I had seen, and they called for backup. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed inside one of the police cars as a witness, and I had to show the people what I had seen. But all they found was the jar. I didn't have to see the jar anymore, but I saw the look in the police officer's face who came back to speak on the radio. He was pale like a ghost. What's more chilling is that they found out where the baby came from. There was a lady in my hometown who had given birth to and killed several babies and stored them inside a freezer. News stories and police told that they had been found thanks to some neighbors who complained about the smell. But in truth, it was because of what happened in the bar. She was killing and selling the clients her babies. The official story, which is pretty easy to find on Google, didn't mention the bar or the 20-something people who were in it. I don't know why they kept it a secret. Maybe because they didn't want to tell anyone what was behind this behavior. I think so. I met the reason outside of the bar. Or maybe it all was from the shock. It was a traumatizing experience, so my actions may be affected by it. But you can be the judge of that. At least posting here will ease my burden at last.
Fortune Laperle crashed his way through the snow, sobbing, straining, cursing his luck, Alaska, Nome, the cards, and the man who had felt his knife. The hot blood was freezing on his hands, and the scene yet bright in his eyes. The man clutching the table and sinking slowly to the floor. The rolling counters and the scattered deck. The swift shiver throughout the room, and the pause. The gamekeepers no longer calling, and the clatter of the chips dying away. The startled faces, the infinite instant of silence, and then the great blood roar and the tide of vengeance which lapped his heels and turned the town mad behind him. All hells broke loose, he sneered, turning aside in the darkness and heading for the beach. Lights were flashing from open doors and tent, cabin, and dance hall that slipped their denizens upon the chase. The clamor of men and howling of dogs smote his ears and quickened his feet. He ran on and on. The sounds grew dim, and the pursuit dissipated itself in vain rage and aimless groping. But a fleeting shadow clung to him. Head thrust over shoulder, he caught glimpses of it, now taking vague shape on an open expanse of snow, now merging into the deeper shadows of some darkened cabin or beach-listed craft. Fortune LaPearl swore like a woman weakly, with the hint of tears that comes of exhaustion, and plunged deeper into the maze of heaped ice, tents, and prospect holes. He stumbled over taut hawsers and piles of dunnage, tripped on crazy guy ropes and insanely planted pegs, and fell again and again upon frozen dumps and mounds of hoarded driftwood. At times, when he deemed he had drawn clear, his head dizzy with the painful pounding of his heart and the suffocating intake of his breath, he slackened down, and ever the shadow leaped out of the gloom and forced him on in heartbreaking flight. A swift intuition flashed upon him, leaving in its trail the cold chill of superstition. The persistence of the shadow he invested with his gambler's symbolism. Silent, inexorable, not to be shaken off. He took it as the fate which waited at the last turn when chips were cashed in and gains and losses counted up. Fortune LaPearl believed in those rare, illuminating moments when the intelligence flung from it time and space tries naked through eternity and read the facts of life from the open book of chance. That this was such a moment he had no doubt, and when he turned inland and sped across the snow-covered tundra, he was not startled because the shadow took upon it greater definiteness and drew in closer. Oppressed with his own impotence, he halted in the midst of the white waste and whirled about. His right hand slipped from its mitten, and a revolver at level glistened in the pale light of the stars. "Don't shoot. I haven't a gun." The shadow had assumed tangible shape, and at the sound of its human voice, a trepidation affected Fortune LaPearl's knees, and his stomach was stricken with the qualms of sudden relief. Perhaps things fell out differently because Yuri Brem had no gun that night when he sat on the hard benches of the El Dorado and saw murder done. To that fact also might be attributed to the trip on the long trail which he took subsequently with a most unlikely comrade. But be it as it may, he reported a second time. "Don't shoot. Can't you see I haven't a gun?" "Then what the flaming hell did you take after me for?" demanded the gambler, lowering his revolver. Yuri Brem shrugged his shoulders. "It don't matter much anyhow. I want you to come with me." "Where?" "To my shack, over on the edge of the camp." But Fortune LaPearl drove the heel of his moccasin into the snow and attested by his various deities to the madness of Yuri Brem. "Who are you?" he perorated. "And what am I that I should put my neck into the rope at your bidding?" "I am Yuri Brem," the other said simply, "and my shack is over there on the edge of the camp. I don't know who you are, but you've thrust the soul from a living man's body. There's the blood red on your sleeve, and like a second Cain, the hand of all mankind is against you, and there is no place that you may lay your head. Now I have a shack. For the love of your mother, hold your say, man, interrupted Fortune Apparel, or I make you a second Abel for the joy of it. So help me, I will. With 1,000 men to lay me by the heels, looking high and low, what do I want with your shack? I want to get out of here. Away, away, away! Cursed swine. I have half a mind to go back and run amok and settle for a few of them, the pigs. One gorgeous, glorious fight at the end of the whole damn business. It's a scheme game. That's what life is, and I'm sick of it. He stopped, appalled, crushed by his great desolation, and Yuri Bram seized the moment. He was not given to speech. This man, and that which followed, was the longest in his life, save one long afterward in another place. That's why I told you about my shack. I can stow you there, so they'll never find you. And I got grub in plenty. Elsewise, you can't get away. No dogs, no nothing. The sea closed. St. Michael the nearest post. Runners to carry the news before you. The same over the port to Anvik. Not a chance in the world for you. Now wait with me till it blows over. They'll forget about you in a month or less. What of stampeding to York and whatnot. And you can hit a trail under their noses. They won't bother. I've got my own ideas about justice. When I ran after you, out of the El Dorado and along the beach, it wasn't to catch you or give you up. My ideas are my own, and that's not one of them. He ceased as the murderer drew a prayer book from his pocket. With the aurora borealis glimmering yellow in the northeast, heads bare to the frost and naked hands grasping the sacred book, Fortune Pearl swore him to the words he had spoken, an oath which Yuri Bram never intended breaking, and never broke. At the end of the door of the shack, the gambler hesitated for an instant, marveling at the strangeness of this man who had befriended him and doubting. But by the candlelight he found the cabin comfortable and without occupants, and he was quickly rolling a cigarette while the other made coffee. His muscles relaxed in the warmth, and he lay back with half-assumed indolence, intently studying Yuri's face through the curling wisps of smoke. It was a powerful face, but its strength was not that particular sort which stands girt in and unrelated. The seams were deep-graven, more like scars, while the stern features were in no way softened by hints of sympathy or humor. Under prominent bushy brows, the eyes shone cold and grey. The cheekbones, high and foreboding, were undermined by deep hollows. The chin and jaw displayed a steadiness of purpose which the narrow forehead advertised as single and, if needs be, pitiless. Everything was harsh, and the nose, the lips, the voice, the lines about the mouth. It was the face of one who communed much with himself, unused to seeking counsel from the world. The face of one who wrestled oft of nights with angels, and rolled to face the day with shut lips that no man might know. He was narrow but deep, and Fortune, his own humanity broad and shallow, could make nothing of him. Did Yuri sing when merry and sigh when sad, he could not have understood. But as it was, the cryptic features were undecipherable. He could not measure the soul they concealed. "Lend a hand, Mr. Man," Yuri ordered when the cups had been emptied. "We've got to go fix up for visitors." Fortune purred his name for the other's benefit, and assisted understandingly. The bunk was built against the side at the end of the cabin. It was a rude affair, the bottom being composed of driftwood logs overlaid with moss. At the foot, the rough ends of these timbers projected in an uneven row. From the side next to the wall, Yuri ripped back the moss and removed 3 of the logs. The jagged ends he sawed off and replaced so that the projecting row remained unbroken. Fortune carried in sacks of flour from the cache and piled them on the floor beneath the aperture. On these, Yuri laid a pair of long sea bags, and overall spread several thicknesses of moss in blankets. Upon these Fortune could lie, with sleeping fur stretched over him from one side of the bunk to the other. And all men could look on it and declare it was empty. In the weeks which followed, several domiciliary visits were paid, not a shack or tent in Nome escaping. But Fortune lay in his cranny, undisturbed. In fact, little attention was given to Yuri Brams, for it was the last place under the sun to expect to find a murderer of John Randolph. Except during such interruptions, Fortune lolled about the cabin, playing long games of solitaire and smoking endless cigarettes. Though his volatile nature loved geniality and play of words and laughter, he quickly accommodated himself to Yuri's taciturnity. Beyond the actions and plans of his pursuers, the state of the trails and the price of dogs, they never talked, and these things were only discussed at rare intervals and briefly. But Fortune fell to working out the system, and hour after hour and day after day, he shuffled and dealt, noted the combinations of the cards in long columns, and shuffled and dealt again. Toward the end, even this absorption failed him, and head bowed upon the table, he visioned the lively all-night houses of Nome, where the gamekeepers and lookouts worked in shifts, and the clattering roulette ball never slept. At such times his loneliness and bankruptcy stunned him, till he sat for hours in the same unblinking, unchanging position. At other times, his long-pent bitterness found voice in passionate outbursts, for he had rubbed the world the wrong way and did not like the feel of it. Life's a scheme game, he was fond of repeating, and on this one note he rang the charges. I never had half a chance, he complained. I was faked in my birth and flim-flammed with my mother's milk. The dice were loaded when she tossed the box, and I was born to prove the loss. But that was no reason she should blame me for it, and look on me as a cluttered deck. But she did. Aye, she did. Why didn't she give me a show? Why didn't the world? Why did I go broke in Seattle? Why did I take the steerage and leave like a hog to Nome? Why did I go to El Dorado? I was heading for Big Pete's and only went for matches. Why didn't I have matches? Why did I want to smoke? Don't you see? All worked out, every bit of it. All parts fitting snug. Before I was born, like as not, I'll put the sack I never hoped to get on it. Before I was born. That's why John Randolph passed the word and his checks in at the same time. Damn him. It served him well right. Why didn't he keep his tongue between his teeth and give me a chance? He knew I was next to broke. Why didn't I hold my hand? Oh, why? And Fortune Lepore would roll upon the floor, vainly interrogating the scheme of things. At such outbreaks, Yuri said no word, save that his grey eyes seemed to turn dull and muddy, as though from lack of interest. There was nothing in common between these two men, and this fact Fortune grasped sufficiently to wonder sometimes why Yuri had stood by him. But the time of waiting came to an end. Even a community's bloodlust cannot stand before its gold lust. The murder of John Randolph had already passed into the annals of the camp, and there it rested. Had the murderer appeared, the men of Nome would certainly have stopped stampeding long enough to see justice done. whereas the whereabouts of Fortune the Pearl were no longer an insistent problem. There was gold in the creek beds and ruby beaches, and when the sea opened, the men with healthy sacks would sail away to where the good things of life were sold absurdly cheap. One night, Fortune helped Yuri Bram harness the dogs and lash the sled, and the twain took the winter trail south of the ice. But it was not all south, for they left the sea east from St. Michael's, crossed the divide, and struck the Yukon at Anvik, many hundred miles from its mouth. Then on into the northeast, past Koyukuk, Tanana, Minuk, till they rounded the great curve at Fort Yukon, crossed and recrossed the Arctic Circle, and headed south through the flats. It was a weary journey, and Fortune would have wondered why the man went with him, had not Yuri told him that he owned claims and had men working at Eagle. Eagle lay on the edge of the line. A few miles farther on, the British flag waved over the barracks at Fort Cudahy. Then came Dawson, Pelly, the Five Fingers, Windyarm, Caribou Crossing, Linderman, the Chilkoot, and Daya. On the morning after passing Eagle, they rose early. This was their last camp, and they were now to part. Fortune's heart was light. There was a promise of spring in the land, and the days were growing longer. The way was passing into Canadian territory. Liberty was at hand, the sun was returning, and each day saw him nearer to the great outside. The world was big, and he could once again paint his future in royal red. He whistled about the breakfast and hummed snatches of light song while Yuri put up the dogs in harnesses and packed up. But when it was all ready, Fortune's feet itching to be off, Yuri pulled an unused backlog to the fire and sat down. Ever hear of the Dead Horse Trail? He glanced up meditatively, and Fortune shook his head, inwardly chafing at the delay. Sometimes there are meetings under circumstances which make men remember, Yuri continued, speaking in a low voice and very slowly. And I met a man under such circumstances at the Dead Horse Trail. Freighting an outfit over the White Pass in '97 broke many a man's heart, and there was a world of reason when they gave that trail its name. The horses died like mosquitoes in the first frost, and from Skagway to Bennett, they rotted in heaps. They died at the rocks, they were poisoned at the summit, and they starved at the lakes. They fell off the trail, what there was of it, or they went through it. In the river, they drowned under their loads, or were smashed to pieces against the boulders. They snapped their legs in the crevices and broke their backs falling backwards with their packs. In the sloughs, they sank from sight or smothered in the slime, and they were disemboweled in the bogs where the corduroy logs turned end up in the mud. Men shot them, worked them to death, and when they were gone, went back to the beach and brought more. Some did not bother to shoot them, stripping off their saddles and shoes and leaving them where they fell. Their hearts turned to stone, those which did not break, and they became beasts, the men on Dead Horse Trail. It was there I met a man with the heart of a Christ and the patience. And he was honest. When he rested at midday, he took the packs from the horses so that they, too, might rest. He paid $50, 100 weight for the fodder, and more. He used his own bed to blanket their backs when they rubbed raw. Other men let the saddles eat holes the size of water buckets. Other men, when the shoes gave out, let them wear their hoofs down to the bleeding stumps. He spent his last dollar for horseshoe nails. I know this because we slept in the one bed and ate from the one pot, and became blood brothers where men lost their grip on things and died blaspheming God. He was never too tired to ease a strap or tighten a cinch, and often there were tears in his eyes when he looked on all that waste of misery. At a passage in the rocks, where the brutes upreared hind-legged and stretched their forelegs upward like cats to clear the wall, the way was piled with carcasses where they had toppled back. And here he stood, in the stench of hell, with a cheery word and a hand on the rump at the right time, till the string passed by. And when one bogged, he blocked the trail till it was clear again. Nor did the man live who crowded him at such time. At the end of the trail, a man who had killed 50 horses wanted to buy, but we looked at him and at our own mountain cayuses from eastern Oregon. 5,000 he offered, and we were broke. But we remembered the poison grass of the summit and the passage in the rocks, and the man who was my brother spoke no word, but divided the cayuses into 2 bunches. His in the one, and mine in the other. And he looked at me, and we understood each other. So he drove mine to the one side, and I drove his to the other. And we took with us our rifles and shot them to the last one, while the man who had killed 50 horses cursed us till his throat cracked. But that man with whom I welded blood brothership on the dead horse trail, why, that man was John Randolph. Fortune, sneering the while, completed the climax for him. Yuri nodded and said, "I am glad you understand." "I am ready," Fortune answered, the old weary bitterness strong in his face again. "Go ahead, but hurry." Yuri Bram rose to his feet. "I have had faith in God all the days of my life. I believe He loves justice. I believe He is looking down upon us now, choosing between us. I believe He waits to work His will through my own right arm. And such is my belief that we will take equal chance and let Him speak His own judgment." Fortune's heart leaped at the words. He did not know much concerning Yuri's God, but he believed in chance, and chance had been coming his way ever since the night he ran down the beach and across the snow. "But there is only one gun," he objected. "We will fire turnabout," Yuri replied, at the same time throwing out the cylinder of the other man's Colt and examining it. "And the cards to decide. 1 hand of 7-Up. Fortune's blood was warming to the game, and he drew the deck from his pocket as Yuri nodded. Surely chance would not desert him now. He thought of the returning sun as he cut for deal, and he thrilled when he found the deal was his. He shuffled and dealt, and Yuri cut him the jack of spades. They laid down their hands. Yuri's was bare of trumps, while he held ace, deuce. The outside seemed very near to him as they stepped off the 50 paces. "If God withholds his hand and you drop me, the dogs and outfit are yours. You'll find a bill of sale already made out in my pocket," Yuri explained, facing the path of the bullet, straight and broad-breasted. Fortune shook a vision of the sun shining on the ocean from his eyes and took aim. He was very careful. Twice he lowered as the spring breeze shook the pines. But the third time, he dropped on one knee, gripped the revolver steadily in both hands, and fired. Yuri whirled half about, threw up his arms, swayed wildly for a moment, and sank into the snow. But Fortune knew he had fired too far to one side, else the man would not have whirled. When Yuri, mastering the flesh and struggling to his feet, beckoned for the weapon, Fortune was minded to fire again. But he thrust the idea from him. Chance had been very good to him already, he felt, and if he tricked now, he would have no pay for it afterward. No, he would play fair. Besides, Yuri was hard to hit and could not possibly hold the heavy Colt long enough to draw a bead. "And where is your god now?" he taunted, as he gave the wounded man the revolver, and Yuri answered, "God has not yet spoken. Prepare that he may speak." Fortune faced him, but twisted his chest sideways in order to present less surface. Yuri tottered about drunkenly, but waited too for the moment's calm between the cat's paws. The revolver was very heavy, and he doubted, like Fortune, because of its weight. But he held it, arm extended above his head, and then let it slowly drop down. At the instant Fortune's left breast and the sight flashed into line with his eye, he pulled the trigger. Fortune did not whirl, but gay San Francisco dimmed and faded. And as the sun-bright snow turned black and blacker, he breathed his last malediction on the chance he had misplaced.
I saw a woman in the blizzard. By Cold Cuts 42.
I'm sitting in my apartment living room right now, having a quick supper of chicken strips and coffee, trying to reconcile my thoughts on the last week or so. And it isn't easy. I figure I should get this down in case I don't get another chance. I'm not really sure where to start. The weather in maritime provinces has been absolute crap the last few weeks, and I hear it's been pretty much the same over all the Northeast. Since that first big storm in January, we've had nearly 2 meters of snowfall here, and it seems every other day everything's closed. The roads are pure ice, the sidewalks are gone, and standing in the middle of the street, you can't see over the drifts on either side. They've recently begun dumping snow in the harbor, for lack of anywhere else to put it. So where do I really begin? I suppose I'll start with some details on my life. I live in a small city that's really just a large town in Atlantic Canada, where I go to a community college, reaching for the stars here, and have recently leased my first ever apartment. It's a pretty okay place, consisting of an old 3-story home converted into 6 single-bedroom apartments. The apartments aren't very big, and the old building's kind of run down, but I've got my own kitchen and bath, and the rent's manageable. Most importantly, I live on my own, in an apartment on the 2nd story. Things had been going pretty well here, until this winter. I was doing well in school, my part-time job was fulfilling, and despite my property manager's conspiratorial joke that there might be a few ghosts about the old place, the apartment had been working out well for me. Some of the doors stick, and the heating's a little iffy at times, but the only real problem I've encountered is that some of the storm windows are cracked, and the inner pane on one window is loose. So, when it's windy, it has a tendency to rattle, and the wind whistles around the frame. So, when Winter Storm Juno hit, I was awakened in the middle of the night to the sound of the wind absolutely shrieking around the window in my living room. I looked over at my alarm clock, and it took me a moment to realize the power was out. So I checked my phone and saw it was around 4 in the morning. Sighing in disgust, but at least taking solace in the fact that I probably wouldn't have class in the morning, I switched on the light on my phone and rolled out of bed to see what I could do about the ungodly noise coming from the next room. The first thing that struck me when my feet hit the hardwood floor was how cold it had gotten in the night, and I quickly shifted on the slippers beside my bed as I headed over and unlatched the bedroom door. When I pulled the door open, I was greeted with a cool breeze and a sound like someone physically assaulting the loose window across the room, along with a small but dismaying pile of snow accumulating on the floor. Muttering a curse on the injustice of nature, I fetched a towel to clean up the snow, and then set about ending the wretched racket the loose window was making, finally managing to stop its rattling by wedging a few cardboard adverts that had arrived in the mail earlier in the week into the space between the glass and its frame. Satisfied that the noise level had dropped to little more than a pitiful whistling, I was turning to go back to bed when my eye caught something moving in the yard below. Straining to see the storm, I could vaguely make out a pale figure walking past the building, trudging along as if it wasn't knee-deep in snow and -40 outside with the wind chill. Between the darkness and blowing snow, I couldn't make out any details of the figure, so after watching it for a few more minutes, I shook my head at the crazy person walking in the blizzard and headed to bed. Apart from a persistent feeling of uneasiness, nothing else happened until Monday's blizzard, when again I woke with a start in the early hours of the morning. Apart from the wind howling outside, everything else was completely silent. A glance at my clock told me it was just before 3, and that thankfully the power was still on. Feeling for the lamp next to my bed, I switched it on and took a look around my room, noting nothing out of the ordinary, until I happened to peer out of the window. There across the street, standing in the swirling snow under a street lamp, was a woman. Her face was obscured by what looked like some sort of mask, but other than that, she wore next to nothing, only some rags on her upper and lower body, which might have once been clothes. She was rail thin, and her skin was the palest of anyone I had ever seen. Her head was angled up, and I knew she was looking directly at me. For a moment, nothing happened as we stared at one another, her in the middle of a blizzard, and me frozen, where I sat in sudden and inexplicable fear. Then I began to hear a voice calling my name across the distance. At first I didn't recognize the voice, and it seemed to have a raspy quality, as if the speaker wasn't used to vocalization. But then it began to sound familiar, becoming the voice of a childhood friend, my mother, a girl I had dated briefly in high school. Every time the voice spoke, it changed, becoming someone else I had known well at one point or another. I sat transfixed, just listening to the call for some time until eventually I was startled into alertness by a sudden shriek. Whether from the wind or the creature outside, I can't say. Released from my terror, I saw the woman had progressed across the street, and in a frenzy I bolted from my bed, scrambling through the door in the living room and slamming it behind me. After ducking into the kitchen to make sure my apartment door was locked, I flicked on all the lights and fell upon my couch to browse Reddit until the sun came up. Anything to take my mind off what had just happened. I must have dozed off, though, because a few hours later, I was once more awakened to the sound of wind screaming and glass rattling back and forth. Figuring the cardboard had slipped out of the window frame, I sat up to fix it, and froze when I saw the source of the noise. Clinging just outside the window, staring in at me, was the woman tapping on the glass and screaming. From this distance, I could now make out every detail of her appearance. Her pale, frostbitten skin stretched over her bones like leather on a wooden frame. Her hands were blackened from the cold, and her nails were gruesomely long and sharp-looking. Her limp dark hair and the ragged remains of her clothes reminded me of something I had seen in the news a few weeks ago about a girl who had gone missing in the big storm. Worst of all, though, was what I had previously mistaken for a mask, as she wore the front of what looked like a carved-out human skull on her face, painted with the lines of a red substance I didn't want to acknowledge as probably being blood. From the sockets of the skull, bright blue eyes peered out, focused intently on me. When she saw that she finally had my attention, her screaming ceased, and it looked like she smiled, though it was difficult to tell behind the perpetual grimace of the skull. She began to talk to me then, in voices just like she'd called to me earlier. And though I hate to admit it, I talked back. I can't repeat what was said. Most of it I don't remember. The rest I don't want to remember. Can't bring myself to even type it out. At the end of our conversation, she pulled away the cracked storm window and lifted the inner pane, strong enough to easily splinter the wood as the metal latch tried to hold it closed. Snow poured in around her as she climbed through the window. I tried to get off the couch and flee as she approached, but none of my muscles responded, and I was left frozen and helpless to watch as one frost-bitten foot and then the other carried her closer to where I sat in shock.
Come with us into the cold,
she said in her rasping, half-growl of a voice, reaching out with sharp, black hands. The last thing I remember before I blacked out was her thumb pressing against my forehead and her ice-blue eyes looking through me. It's been 3 days since then. I awoke Monday afternoon to an apartment that was cold, but otherwise the same. The window was closed, though the wood over the latch was still splintered, the storm pane still broken. Feeling something tacky in my hair, I reached up to find a line of blood on my forehead, trailing from a small puncture just below the hairline. After that, I searched the apartment over, contacted my property manager about a window that had broken during the storm, and tried to get on with my life. Today, I awoke later than usual. It was late afternoon when I got out of bed, but luckily everything was still shut down from Monday's storm, and it's starting to squall again, already a near whiteout. I've just realized I forgot to cook the chicken I've been eating. I've finished half of it, and as I type this, I'm taking another bite. It's getting dark out, and this is the last of my storm food. Maybe I should go find some more. starving. I woke up to a freezing cold blizzard. If everyone receives this message, please send help. I live in Redacted, and my family and I are in dire need of assistance. We are freezing to death and need help now. I know this is all confusing, but my fingers are so cold. We can't get out of our house. Let me start from the beginning as best I can. I woke up in the middle of the night to sounds of my mom and dad moving in the living room. It was freezing, like brutally cold. A kind of unnatural cold that seeps into your body and remains there no matter how many blankets or layers of clothing you put on. I could only lay there in my bed, frozen by the cold. I wondered why it was so damn cold. When I went to sleep, everything was cozy. I had snuggled into bed under layers of warm blankets and fell into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by the cold. I heard my older brother stir from his room next door and trot down the hallway to join Mom and Dad in the living room. I could hear whispers of concern and worry, and I thought something bad was happening. I checked my watch, saw it was 3:22 in the morning. Way too early for any of us to be awake, but I guess the fact that I could see my breath meant that something was wrong with our house and our heat. For the house to get this cold in a short matter of time seemed bizarre. "What are we going to do? We're not going to freeze," I heard my mom whispering. "We're going to freeze." "We're not going to freeze. We'll have to get a fire going. Adam, I'm going to need your help," Dad said. I heard Adam let out a long sigh before moving to help Dad. I took in a deep breath, preparing myself for the grating cold that would assault me when I pushed the blankets from my body. But I had to know what was going on. I pushed the blankets off quickly and scrambled for the dresser drawer to find a warm pair of fleece-lined pants, a hat, and 2 hoodies. There was no way I wanted to put on my proper winter coat to sit in the house. It just didn't seem right at all. I met the rest of my family in the dark living room. My mom sat on the couch dressed in warm clothes and with several blankets around her. Our eyes met, and she called me over and tossed me a few spare blankets, shivering all the while. I could see the digital thermostat said the room was currently only 23 Fahrenheit. My dad and brother were trying their best to light a fire, but they didn't have enough good kindling to really get it going. Black smoke billowed into the room, making us all cough. "Damn it!" my dad shouted in frustration. Dad kept lighting pieces of newspaper, trying to get a large log to catch on fire, while my brother kept fanning the flames, hoping to get it going. We kept a few pieces of wood in the house for emergencies, but the vast majority of our firewood, like everyone else's, was kept in a small shack on the line of our property. I don't think we used the fireplace more than a handful of times in 5 years. "What's going on with the heat? How'd it get so cold in here?" I asked. "Heaters are broken, it seems. There must be some sort of freak storm out there because the temperature really dropped. It must be in the negatives out there," Dad said with a frown. "Is the fire almost ready?" Mom asked. "It's not starting. All our kindling is outside. We'll need more firewood too eventually, even if we do get this goddamn thing started. I'll have to go gear up and grab some." Adam chimed in at that moment. "I'll go out there and get it. You stay in here and keep trying to light the fire." Dad seemed hesitant at first, but granted him permission. "All right, but don't mess around out there. Just get the wood and come back. Too cold to be out there for too long. You'll get frostbite." Adam seemingly brushed this warning off. He was cocky and usually dismissed my parents' advice. He was the rebellious one, while I was typically more level-headed and rational. Oh, fuck. What am I saying? I was a goddamn pussy compared to Adam. Adam went back down the hall for a few seconds. I looked to my dad, who kept trying to light more newspapers in an attempt to get the log to catch fire. My mom only pulled her blankets around her tighter as she desperately watched to see if the fire would start. I pushed up one of the blinds to try to see outside, but found that all the windows were frosted over, making it almost impossible to see anything clearly. You could make out shapes and colors, but beyond that, there was not much of anything you could see. I could see large snowflakes coming down out there. Apparently, a snowstorm had blown in unexpectedly. I turned back to see my brother emerge from the hall, dressed in his large winter coat and decorated with a thick hat and heavy gloves. He carried a large sled that was slung over his back and held with a rope. "This is going to be sweet," Adam bragged. Dad looked at him angrily. "What the hell is the sled for? You are only supposed to get some firewood and kindling and come back. The house is freezing. This isn't time for you to mess around." Yeah. Of course the sled is for wood and stuff. I can drag it through the snow in this. It'll be easier." Dad couldn't really argue with that logic, I guess. He certainly could bring back more wood on the sled than carrying it by hand. I followed Adam to the back door. I wanted to see what was going on outside. At the time, I was curious how a storm like this had come on with no warning. Adam opened the door quickly, revealing clearly what was going on outside. I took a peek and saw snow piled high and more falling in almost blizzard-like conditions. Shards of ice hung from the roof of our house like cold daggers. In the distance, through the hazy wall of snow and ice, I swear I could see a human-like figure illuminated by a subtle blue light. It waved its arms in the cold night. It seemingly had no lower torso that I could see, only an upper torso that seemed to connect to the snow as something. It swayed back and forth in an almost rhythmic motion. A shudder ran through me, and I instinctively blinked. Then I could see nothing but the blizzard continuing to rage. A frigid wind pushed its way into the house with a roar that chilled me to the core. The house creaked as the strong wind buffeted the sides. I watched him shut the door behind him, fighting against the strong wind that so desperately wanted to invade more of our house. I ran over to the windows to peer out and saw his silhouette grew smaller and smaller as he made his way over to the wood shack. We sat in the living room and waited for Adam to return. My dad kept trying to light the fire while Mom went to work making us coffee and hot cocoa to hopefully help warm us. I sat down on the couch with a cup of hot cocoa and saw my dad struggling to keep the log burning alongside sips of his coffee, but the log continued to scorch and smoke up the place. We drank our lukewarm beverages and waited, and waited, and waited. Dad by this time had given up on getting the fire going without some proper kindling or smaller pieces of wood. Eventually, we began to grow concerned. It shouldn't have taken 20 minutes to gather a few pieces of wood and kindling from the shack. The three of us were by the windows, trying to look for a sign of him. I went over to the window again and tried to look out to see if I could get a view of him. I could see that figure again, or at least the outline highlighted by the blue light. The silhouette danced in the blizzard. Looking at it made me feel cold and hollow, but I couldn't determine what it was through the frosted glass. I was about to call my dad over to look at it when he started speaking. "What the hell is keeping that boy? I better suit up and go find out what's going on out there. Seems it's getting even colder. We need to get this fire going." Dad was right, of course. The house temperature had dropped to 16 degrees, and if things continued, it would get even colder. My dad piled up the blankets on one of the windows, trying to look outside to see what was going on, but a thick layer of ice kept us from really seeing too much, save for murky silhouettes. I put my face closer to the window. I could feel the cold air seeping through our house, eradicating the remaining warmth our house held. Suddenly, a loud crack rang through the house as something smashed into a window. It cracked, and I jumped back as my mom let out a shrill scream. Dad turned towards the source of the noise. "What the hell was that?" Dad yelled. Something hit the window. It's cracked," I said. "What was it? I know it's windy out there, but to crack a window like that?" "I don't know what it was, but something definitely hit the window. I think there might be something else out there." "Something else out there? Like an animal? I don't think birds are flying in this weather. I'm going outside. I need to see what is going on out there. I need to find Adam. He's probably messing around building a whole snowman family or sledding down hills like I told him not to. We need to get this place warm soon, or the pipes will freeze and burst, if they haven't already." "No, I don't know. It looks like someone off in the distance is waving their arms." Jeez. Probably your idiot brother messing around out there. I told him this was important, and of course he didn't listen. This time, I volunteered to go outside with my dad and help him. 2 of us could carry more wood, or at least I could look to find Adam and bring him back on to his task. Things were beginning to look dire for us if we didn't get the fire going. I put on my heaviest coat, snow boots, hat, and gloves. Dad and I made our way to the back door. I was feeling a bit nervous about the whole thing. There was no way that figure was Adam. Outside was colder than I expected. The cold went right through my coat and clothing. I couldn't believe Adam would want to be out in this, even if he did want to go sledding. I followed behind my dad as the blizzard raged, and about halfway to the woodshed, we saw the sled. It was mostly buried under falling snow. There was wood on it, but with it being covered in snow and mostly frozen, it was now useless. My dad pulled the sled from the snow and pushed the frozen wood off. "I need to get dry wood. You go look for your brother. He couldn't have gone far," Dad yelled at me. My dad's form quickly faded as he walked off into the blizzard. I turned and went the other way. Visibility was getting even worse than when I had looked out the front door before, and there was no way I could stay out here for that long. I walked around yelling my brother's name again and again, trying to get him to come out. My toes and fingers were already beginning to feel cold. It was then I started hearing a crunching noise, like someone was walking through the snow, following me. I thought it might be Adam trying to scare me, staying just out of sight to mess with me. I was honestly getting pretty scared. My heart beat fast. Being out in the freezing dark of night was not all that fun, and I had an intense feeling that I was in danger. I had seen something strange earlier and was already feeling nervous when I came out. A figure finally came into view, and I felt a moment of relief. But as the figure drew closer, my relief turned into sheer horror when I realized it was not Adam. It was not my dad either. It was something else shambling towards me. Heavy footfalls left imprints in the snow that quickly froze over. I could feel cold radiating off this thing as it grew closer. A frozen eyeball hung from its eye socket. It wore clothes that were torn and ragged, revealing bluish-gray flesh that was definitely unnatural. Icicles hung from the ends of its clothes. There were holes in its skin exposing grim yellow bones. Some protruding out had frozen over. The thing stepped toward me, and I instinctively began moving away from it. It opened its mouth, letting out a noise that was a mix between a roar and a moan, before snow poured out of its mouth and onto the ground, adding to the already deep snowfall. I screamed and darted off away from this thing. I didn't even go toward the house, I was so panicked. I didn't know what the hell this thing was, but I knew I had to get the hell away from it. I heard it following me for a bit, but it couldn't match my speed as I trampled through the snow. I tripped and fell. My body sunk into the cold snow, and I actually began to feel warm. They do say that people often feel warm when they are starting to freeze. Adrenaline pumped through me as I pushed myself to free myself from the snow. I tried to calm myself down. I cupped my hands over my eyes to try and see where I was, the snow now a nearly blinding blizzard. Not far in front of me was a large pile of snow. It was unnatural. No one had shoveled it there, and there were no plows around that could have piled the snow that high. I eyed the pile for a moment with suspicion and fear. I realized I needed to get back home, but as I was about to run off, bits of snow began to roll down off the pile before greater cracks appeared. Suddenly, a skeletal hand pierced the barrier of the snow, causing more snow from the pile to fall to the ground. A skeletal head appeared, unnatural blue light escaping from its sockets of the skull. There was a distinctive crown of ice that almost sparkled. I stood paralyzed with fear, or maybe it was the cold. I felt colder than I have ever felt before as I realized that this was the thing I had seen earlier. It had been covered in snow in that short amount of time. It shook its head, causing more snow to fall from the pile and hit the ground before starting to move its long, lanky arms that pushed the majority of snow off it. It had an upper torso, but its lower torso was seemingly nothing more than snow and ice. I could only watch in horror as the thing placed a hand onto the ground. Moments later, there were areas of blue light seemingly penetrating the thick snow around me. I watched as more and more spots began to get that sickly bluish glow. And then they all faded. The snow affected by that blue light all began to crack and move on its hands, and then bodies emerged. They were the same as the thing I had seen earlier, bluish gray skin and ragged clothes. The cold was almost unbearable now. I couldn't feel my fingers or toes, but I knew I had to move as the things began to wail and shamble toward me. I was so scared as I ran to the house. I could hear the footfalls of those zombie-like things following behind me as fast as they could. When I reached the house, I felt a sense of relief, but as I ran past the cracked window toward the door, my foot stepped on something, causing me to nearly trip and fall. I quickly took a moment to dig around the snow and pulled out something heavy and covered in frost and snow. I turned it over in my hand and brushed off some of the snow, terror flooding into me as the snow fell from the object. Cold, dead eyes stared up at me, the visage frozen into a look of pure terror. It only took me a second to realize what it was as I dropped the thing and turned to vomit. It was Adam's severed head. One of those things must have gotten to him. I ran inside the house and panicked with tears in my eyes. The house was warmer now, and my dad was there by a healthy fire, taking off his winter coat and hat. "Did you find Adam?" Dad asked. I couldn't muster a response. How the hell could I tell him that Adam was dead? I tried to keep my tears back, but they came out anyway with heavy streams. I blubbered like a baby for a moment, trying to compose myself. Yeah, my brother was kind of a dick, but he was still family. I figured my dad would think I was being a baby or mock me, but a serious look of concern came over his face. My mom had got up too, and now eyed me curiously. I didn't want to be the one to break the news. "What's wrong? Where's Adam?" Dad asked me again. I didn't answer him, only stood there crying. My mom put her arm around me and sat me down on the couch. My mind was a mix of grief and fear. Those things were still out there. It took a moment of crying before I found my resolve to tell them what was going on. "There's these things out there, a lot of them now. One got Adam. I think they're coming this way." They didn't even have time to process what I was saying when a heavy thud came from the side of the house. We all stopped for a moment and listened. Then there was another thud and another. Suddenly, the cracked window from earlier broke, and one of those things toppled in, bringing with it a stream of cold wind. Snow steadily poured from its mouth. What the fuck is that?" Dad shouted in horror. The thing lunged at my dad, sinking its frozen teeth into his neck. Dad screamed as it tore into him, blood squirting from his neck in a vicious spray that coated the thing's face. Dad kicked at the thing, sending it toppling to the ground as another had begun to crawl in the window. It grabbed my mom's hand, who stood there shocked and screaming in terror. He clutched his other hand at his bleeding neck. More of them were entering the room through the window now. I heard a boom as our door toppled to the ground, and more of those things poured into the room, bringing with them snow and ice. We ran down the hallway to the basement. It had a heavy door of steel that we were able to lock and keep those things out. That brings us to now. I can hear their footsteps and moans above us. It's slowly getting colder down here. We were able to stop Dad from bleeding, but now he has some sort of frostbite and has fallen unconscious. Mom just sits in the corner crying and crying and crying. It's so cold down here. I don't think we have long. I called 911 and they said they were sending someone, but that was half an hour ago. I don't think they can get through the snow and ice. This is my last attempt to get help. Please, for the love of God, help us.
I won't give a long backstory, because it doesn't matter. Basically, he got a job through a former schoolmate of his, who worked in some mid-level party position. Father was always down on his luck, and this time was no different. At this time, his friend Igor happened to see him at the local bar. They got to talking, and Igor pulled some strings and gave him the position. Didn't matter that he wasn't qualified. Half the guys aren't, he was told. Anyway, Dad started working there in 1984 and did a pretty good job. He did as he was told. Most of it was just checking dial readouts and making sure pipes were sealed and whatnot. In late 1985 and early 1986, he started noticing far more party representatives coming in and out of the plant. Usually the visits were limited to compliance officers and hazardous material supervisors when radioactive material was moved in or out. But these weren't plant specialists. They looked like Politburo. He told me he recognized a couple of them from television speeches, but he didn't remember the names. He just knew they were high-ranking. On the night of meltdown, Dad was doing his usual valve and dial checks when Politburo members, accompanied by soldiers with loaded Kalashnikovs, streamed down the hall toward the reactor area.
The soldiers were wearing radiation suits of all things. The party members weren't. He tagged along a few dozen meters away and went on a catwalk high up where he could see all of them. They crowded around cooling pools. Dad made an effort to act as if he was staring at the pressure readouts in front of him, vaguely noticing they were rising as he watched. This was around the point when the lights cut out. Apparently, this wasn't abnormal for the plant. The electrical systems were under-maintained, and all of the electricians on staff were tasked with more critical reactor work. Even with the lights not working, Cherenkov radiation cast its characteristic blue glow over the group and illuminated the politicians and soldiers. The water in the pool started moving. Now, Father wasn't a nuclear engineer. Still, he knew whatever was happening in the pool was abnormal. He'd been by the area plenty of times, and never once did the water move like it did right then. It sloshed with turbidity and looked like it was coming to a rolling boil. He glanced at the dials in front of him and saw the temperature and pressure in the loop system was dramatically higher than it should have been. As he was beginning to sprint across the catwalk toward the nearest alarm station, he saw something that made him stop. What he told me then didn't make much sense at first. You have to figure someone running at a dead sprint to pull an emergency alarm at the nuclear power plant station wouldn't stop for anything. But he stopped. And he stared. Something had floated to the top of the boiling water. The way he described it, it was dark, grayish red, almost shaped like a person, but much bigger and dreadfully deformed. It floated face down in the pool. The party members didn't react, but the soldiers raised their rifles at the thing until one of the politicians barked order at them to stand down. A moment or two later, and the thing crawled out of the pool and raised itself on thick legs to stand before the gathered crowd. What Father said he remembered most about the thing was its head. It sat directly on top of its lopsided shoulders, and it had no eyes, no ears, no nose. All that was there was a gaping hole. Not even a mouth, but a hole. And inside, the same blue glow from the pool shone out onto the faces of the people surrounding it. Someone else at the plant must have noticed the temperature and pressure abnormalities and pulled the alarm, because sirens began to blare and diesel generators were galvanized into action to force the cooling cycle into overdrive. None of that mattered to Father, though. He said the thing approached the soldiers, one by one, and without any of them putting up a fight, it pressed the hole in its face against the top of each of their heads, and they started to dissolve. First their suits melted, and then their skin began to blister and char. The thing moved its maw downward until it nearly reached their legs, which dropped to the ground in smoldering heap. It then did the same to the assembled Politburo, all but one. She stood in the middle of the pile of streaming legs and heaps and crotches and stared at the atrocity. Then she screamed at it. It's something Father said he's repeated to himself every day since. Zalitso na poshve, salt of the earth. As the words left her mouth, the Geiger counter Father was forced to carry with him at all times exploded into life. At the same instant, the politician burst into flames. He could swear she smiled as she burned. All this was finally enough for Dad to make a break for it. He knew he'd been irradiated badly, but he took some solace in the fact that the ticks in the counter slowed quickly as he left the pool area. Right before he was clear of the room, he took one last glimpse at the thing. It had begun to melt. As soon as its body began pouring through the metal grate, the water below erupted in a mass of superheated steam. Father avoided being scalded to death by about half a second when he turned the corner and slammed the door behind him. The rest of the meltdown played out more or less like it was eventually reported. Father was able to get out before the main explosions. He lived with the profound guilt of running by his colleagues, who still didn't know something truly catastrophic was about to happen. He believed his thyroid cancer was payment for his indifference toward them during his escape. The iconic photograph of the radioactive elephant's foot in the basement of the power plant stood framed on his dresser for the rest of his life. As he told me this story, he confessed he kept it to remind him of the implications of the politician's words before she was devoured by the flames. That thing will render the area around it uninhabitable for 100 years, he sighed. It's melting through the ground, even today. If it hits the groundwater, it'll explode like a dirty bomb and make the disaster in '86 look like a firecracker. Russia, Europe, North Africa, all irradiated. He died a couple of days after he shared his experience with me. I just have no idea what to do with it all. Obviously, he couldn't have made the whole thing up, but I don't know why he would. He doesn't have anything to gain now that he's gone. Maybe some of the other survivors or their kids can corroborate parts of what he said. Maybe they can't. Either way, if it's true, there is so much more going on with that disaster than we've been told. Even now, as that radioactive slag melts into the ground, Father's story almost makes it sound like the meltdown was just a precursor to something far worse. Something plotted. Please, if anyone can give some advice or insight, it would be appreciated. I don't want what he told me to be true, but Zalitsona Porshva terrifies me more than I can bear.
The Girl in the Snowstorm by Foggy Glass Eye.
I've seen her again, the girl in the snowstorm. I didn't know that I was in danger the first time I saw her. On the contrary, it was an experience that I kept thinking about all winter. It was over a decade ago, and I was visiting a friend that morning to drop off a Christmas present for him. It was a few miles from home, but I enjoyed the walk, despite it being an even colder winter than usual. My mother had warned me to return home soon, as the local news was predicting a blizzard that evening, so I kept my visit brief and started home that afternoon. By the time I'd made it halfway, the wind was brutally cold, and the snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see where I was. It was too late to turn back and bunker down at my friend's place, so I had to keep walking home. I wore glasses back then, switched to contacts a few years ago, and had to take them off. It was bad enough to see everything as white blurs, but it was impossible to see anything through wet, snow-covered lenses. Walking through a blizzard without being able to see is a helpless feeling. You can only hope that you're heading the right way, fighting the wind, not to just stay upright, but to make sure that you don't lose your sense of direction. You can't see nearby buildings very well, and you're constantly on the lookout for familiar sights that can tell you where you're at. I followed the sidewalk as best I could, occasionally stepping off the curb onto someone's lawn. It was in this blurry haze of wind and snow that I first saw the girl. The first thing I noticed was the red scarf blowing madly in the wind. She was walking in the opposite direction at first, and it looked like she was on the other side of the street. The closer she got, the more I questioned what direction I was looking in. Was she crossing the street, or was I not walking on the sidewalk anymore? I could barely tell where I was. I took a moment to make sure I was still on the sidewalk, and by the time I confirmed where the girl was, she was only a few yards away. I could see her more clearly. She was wearing a mismatched assortment of winter clothes and a lot of layers, even 2 hats. Her puffy blue jacket was oversized and unzipped, and underneath I could see that she was wearing another heavy coat. She didn't look intimidating at all. On the contrary, she looked very vulnerable. She was short and notably thin, almost unhealthily so. I was almost 10 at the time, and I imagined that she couldn't have been older than that. The way she was bundled up in so many layers of clothes made her look uncomfortable and gave her an uneven, lumpy shape. I assumed at the time that she was poor, maybe even homeless. Instead of walking past each other, we simply stopped in front of one another. Something compelled me to stare down at her, and she looked up at me with a sort of vague expression. Her hat scarf covered most of her face, leaving only her eyes and a part of her cheeks visible. Her eyes were so big and dark, like little black holes against her pale skin and the surrounding snow. I lost myself in her stare, like I was falling into her very eyes. It was like I was in some sort of trance, pulled to her without realizing it, making me utterly passive. She took her earmuffs off, but didn't speak. "Hi," I said weakly, not knowing what to say. She looked me up and down, and something about that look made me shiver, even in the cold. It was like she was taking stock of me, of what I had to offer. Before I could ask what she wanted, the girl held her hands up. They were pale, shaking and bare. The girl didn't have any gloves. Something about the way she looked at me so impatiently made me look down at my own gloved hands. I didn't have a particularly good set of gloves, but they were the only pair I had. I looked at her again, and something about her big dark eyes made me want to give them to her. I took my gloves off and held them out for her to take. I almost regretted it, but then her freezing hand touched my bare skin as she took them, and they were so cold that I knew I was doing the right thing. She put the gloves on, looked up and smiled. The scarf was still covering most of her face, but I could see in it how her cheeks raised up and in the sparkle of her eyes. As she started to walk past me, I realized the blizzard was easing up. I put my glasses on again, turned around and looked at the girl. She had stopped walking and was staring down at the gloves, I assumed admiring them. "Merry Christmas," I mumbled to myself as she looked back at me, almost as if she heard me over the wind. I waved, realized my hands were cold, and shoved them into my jacket pockets. She nodded and turned around, continuing her walk to wherever she was going, but not in any sort of hurry. I was only a block away from my house, so my hands weren't cold for very long. When I walked inside, my mother immediately noticed that my gloves were missing. For some reason, I didn't tell her the truth, despite how chivalrous it would have made me look and sound. I lied, suggesting that I must have forgotten them at my friend's house, and then went up to my room. Something about the girl made me want to keep our interaction private, like it was something special. I sat down on my bed and mulled over what I'd just experienced, and just done. I didn't exactly have a crush on the girl, but something about the way she stared at me was so compelling, like I was defenseless against it. I wanted to see her again. I looked out from my bedroom window, somehow expecting to see the girl, and she was there, on the other side of the street. It was like she'd been waiting for me to want her to be there. I opened my window, blasted suddenly by cold air, and waved at her. She waved back, then started walking away. I watched her walk out of view, wondering who she was, where she had come from, and if she was ever there at all. Something about her, though, felt unreal, like I'd vividly imagined her. I hoped to see her again that winter, but never did. Whenever I went outside shoving my hands into my pockets, I wondered if she still had those gloves. Whenever I got home, I checked through my window to see if she was standing on the other side of the street again, waiting for me like she had that first time. I daydreamed even about running into her during one of my walks, which just so happened to become more and more frequent. But I never saw her. Not as a child, anyway. That year was memorably cold. Blizzards moved in and out. Roads were all slick with ice, and inches of snow fell every day. We always had some snow, but that year was bad. This winter has been pretty heavy so far, but not on that level. We've had a lot of snow and ice, but no blizzards yet. It's the perfect kind of winter for long walks in the snow. Last week, I was enjoying the season and going out on a long walk. It was snowing lightly and the sky was a solid white of clouds. It was a very peaceful walk at first, but then I saw something in the distance on the other side of the street. It was a girl, short and bundled up in layers of winter clothing. Most of the clothes were different, but the red scarf brought me right back to that meeting a decade before. It was her. I'd been obsessed with this girl since childhood, reminded of her every winter for years. It was like opening a time capsule of memories buried in the back of my mind since I was in middle school. But at the same time, it was more than memories. She was standing right across the street in mostly different clothes, but the girl was the same size, the same height, like she hadn't aged a day. I was lost in that impossible thought, wondering if she was just really short and petite, when I realized that she was crossing the street and heading in my direction. Does she recognize me? I wondered. I couldn't move, and I didn't want to. Something was so disarming about this surreal sight of this girl from 10 years ago. I remembered wondering as a child if I'd imagined her all up. Hadn't she followed me home and waved at me from across the street, though? Did I just make that up and forget that it wasn't true? She stepped right in front of me and looked up. I remembered how I'd looked down into her large eyes, so dark that they looked black against the white of her face and snow. And here we were again. I was an adult, sure enough, and she was still a child. Her scarf still covered up her lower face just as before, but I could see from the upper half that she looked exactly the same, like she walked through time to see me again. However, the clothes she had changed. Her scarf was worn and stained, her jacket ripped in some places. She had a different pair of gloves on that looked fairly new, and I wondered if some young boy gave them to her. Did he also think he had imagined her? She looked me up and down, and I remembered that she did the same thing the last time, taking stock, I assumed, in the moment that she was looking for something to ask me for, another article of clothing to keep warm, and I was right. She settled on my scarf, and she lightly tugged on it as if demanding it from me. I pulled off the scarf, ignoring how cold it suddenly made my neck, and handed it over. There was something so strange about the experience that I just felt like I had to go with it, if only to see where it was going. Like before, I was compelled by something in her stare to do what she wanted. I was transfixed by this impossible girl. Then she removed her red scarf, and I almost let myself scream. The skin of her mouth and chin was stained red, and large fangs jutted down amongst her upper teeth. She looked up as she dropped her old scarf on the ground and started putting mine around her neck, giggling at the sight of my fear. I was grateful when she covered her mouth with my scarf, but still terrified. I was glued to the spot, but desperately wanted to run. She had a sort of disarming aura about her, but it was gone, replaced by danger. I felt compelled to get away from this bloody-mouthed child, but I was frozen in place at the same time. She laughed again, the light and innocent joy of youth. And then she spoke for the first time.
I remember you. Did you move?
I shook my head slightly, unable to move. I couldn't stop staring at her eyes. At first, I'd assumed they were brown and simply looked darker in contrast to the light. But now I could see the endless pits of blackness in her eyes. I could feel a sort of force moving from her eyes to me, compelling me to stay put and do what she wanted. She had me under her spell, and she knew it. It was funny to her, and she loved it.
Oh, I think I remember where you live then,
she said before giggling again.
Thanks for the scarf and the gloves. Stay warm.
She walked past me. I heard her footsteps in the snow get farther away, but I couldn't will myself to turn around. I didn't want to see her right behind me, admiring her new scarf as she'd admired the gloves I'd given her a decade ago. Would I have waved at her too if she was there? I imagined that I would have, if I had the feeling that was what she wanted. When I got home, I locked the doors and windows, willing myself not to look out and see if she was there waiting for me again, like she had been the first time. I haven't left the house since. I've tried to convince myself that she was imaginary, but I'd rather be terrified than let myself believe that I am crazy. My mom asked me if I was okay yesterday. I brushed it off and asked her about the heavy winter a decade before. She recalled that it was particularly bad, even worse than they had thought at the time. When I asked what she meant, she told me that the local news kept running stories that following spring about a few missing people who'd been found after the snow all melted away, dead on the side of the road, as if they'd just keeled over and been covered by the snow without anyone noticing. My mom also remembered that one of the missing was from this side of town. I've since looked into it, and this side of town is really only a mile or so away from our home. The article I found mentioned that the person who discovered the body said that there was dried blood on their coat and neck, like they'd cut themselves falling, and bled to death right by the sidewalk. I have my own theories. You may be wondering why I'm staying indoors when the girl from the snowstorm knows where I live. The thing is, I'm not sure she can enter my home without an invitation. Either way, I'm not going to risk going outside again. Not that I have the courage to do so in the first place. I can barely will myself to look out the window at this point. I don't know what to do besides share my experience with all of you, in the hopes that you are also careful this winter. Even if you are not a local, there is no telling how many of these things are out there. And if you have to go outside, bundle up. Stay warm.